The Tyre Nichols case, man. That one really, it stuck with me.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it has with a lot of our listeners, too. And so today we're going to do a deep dive on it. We're going to look at it from a couple different angles. First, we've got this AP article, hot off the presses, about, the convictions of 3 of the officers that were involved.
Right.
But we've also got this book called Misguided Badges. Have you ever heard of this thing?
I have, yeah. It's by a retired Shelby County Sheriff's Captain Terry Yarbrough.
Okay.
And he really takes a hard look at police culture in the book, talks about systemic racism. It's a pretty thought-provoking read, I'd say.
And one of the things that makes this Tyre Nichols case even more complicated is that everybody involved was black.
Oh, yeah.
Tyre Nichols, the officers charged, everybody. So we're going to go kind of beyond just the surface level stuff that most of the media coverage is doing.
Right.
We're going to go deeper and look at the systemic issues that are at play.
Absolutely. I think that's really key here. It's crucial to understand that the nuances of this verdict, the AP article highlights that these 3 officers, yeah, they were found guilty, but they were acquitted of some of the harshest charges, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, what does that mean for police brutality and how our justice system actually addresses those issues?
Yeah, I mean, are we making progress? Is it enough?
Exactly.
And it's hard not to think about Tyre Nichols as a person in all of this.
Right.
The AP article mentions how he was calling out for his mother. And he even said, I'm just trying to go home.
Oh, man.
It's heartbreaking. And this wasn't just some headline, This was a real person.
Absolutely. And this is where I think Misguided Badges is so helpful, right?
Yeah.
Because it digs into this whole bad apples culture in policing.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that term.
Right. We've all heard it.
Yeah.
But the book challenges that notion. Like, it really pushes back on that simplistic way of thinking about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's always easy to just say, oh, it's just a few bad apples.
Right. But Misguided Badges, it kind of goes deeper and looks at, like, the systemic issues in police departments, Is the training adequate? Is there really accountability? What about the leadership? Do they tolerate misconduct?
Yeah.
And it even brings up this case where there's this officer that had been reported, like, over and over again for using excessive force, but nothing really happened until, like, a super egregious incident blew up in the public. And that's what it took.
Wow.
And the book is arguing that, that delay, that inaction, it just allows this pattern of bad behavior to continue.
So what you're saying is, by only focusing on individual officers, we might be missing the bigger picture.
Right. It's like we're putting a Band-Aid on a much larger wound.
Yeah.
And the wound just keeps bleeding.
So how does this whole Gad apples thing apply to the Tyre Nichols case? Because race isn't the main issue here.
Right. And I think that's what makes this case so compelling, because it forces us to look beyond, just simple explanations, right? And it shows that these harmful dynamics can exist even when you have a police force where, the officers are black. It's not just about race, it's about the system itself. And Misguided Badges, makes the argument that when you have weak accountability and not enough oversight, misconduct can thrive.
Yeah.
Regardless of who the officers are.
It really emphasizes that, like you said, we need to address the root of the problem.
The root causes, absolutely.
And speaking of that, Misguided Badges also gets into the whole issue of systemic racism in policing, which it's tough to talk about.
Yeah.
But it's important.
It's something we can't shy away from.
Yeah.
And the book really argues that systemic racism isn't always about individual officers, being explicitly racist. It's about policies, practices, and just ingrained biases within law enforcement. And that leads to racial disparities.
So what's an example of that? Can you give us something from the book?
Sure. So one thing that Misguided Badges talks about is over-policing of certain neighborhoods. And often those are neighborhoods with majority minority populations. And that leads to way more encounters with law enforcement.
Yeah.
And that increases the likelihood of, negative interactions, even for minor offenses. And those minor things, those can escalate.
Right.
And that can lead to, really tragic outcomes. And often this over-policing is justified by crime statistics.
Right.
But the book argues that those statistics themselves can be skewed because of the biases that already exist in law enforcement.
So it's this vicious cycle.
It is.
And it makes you wonder, could these systemic issues that Misguided Badges talks about have played a role in the Tyre Nichols tragedy?
Yeah. Even if the officers involved were also black.
Yeah.
It's the question we have to ask ourselves.
Right.
While we can't ignore the specifics of what happened in this case, we also have to consider the bigger picture. And that bigger picture is systemic issues that lead to a culture where violence and impunity are kind of the norm within law enforcement.
We got to change that culture. And you know what? Speaking of the bigger picture, Attorney General Merrick Garland, he put out a really powerful statement after the verdict.
Right.
And for our listeners who may not know, Merrick Garland is the head of the Department of Justice.
Yes, he is. And that statement carries a lot of weight.
It does.
He emphasized how serious these charges were. He talked about how the Justice Department is committed to holding law enforcement accountable.
Yeah.
And I'm going to quote him here directly. He said, "The Justice Department will continue to seek justice for Tyre Nichols." So he's making it clear that this case matters not just locally, but nationally.
And I thought it was really interesting how he talked about how public trust in law enforcement erodes when things like this happen.
Yeah.
He's acknowledging the impact these cases have on communities. It's not just about, one incident.
That's not isolated.
Right.
And the fact that federal charges were brought against these officers, I think that's a big deal.
Yeah.
It sends a message that police misconduct will be investigated, it'll be prosecuted no matter where it happens, no matter who's involved.
So after looking at all of this, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to think about?
For me, the key takeaway is that police misconduct is a complicated issue. It has deep roots, right? Holding individual officers accountable, yes, that's important, but it's not enough. We have to confront the systemic issues that allow these tragedies to happen in the first place. We have to address things like inadequate training, a lack of accountability, and the cultural biases that exist within law enforcement.
You've given us a lot to think about today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And if any of our listeners out there want to learn more about this, would you recommend Misguided Badges as a place to start?
Absolutely. It's a really thought-provoking book. It sheds light on how policing works, and it really highlights the urgent need for reform.
Yeah, I might have to pick up a copy myself.
I think you should.
Well, this has been a heavy deep dive, but an important one. We can't let these conversations stop here. So we encourage all of you to keep exploring these issues, keep learning, keep listening to different perspectives.
Absolutely.
And thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.